Hello and welcome. I'm Patrick Curtis, your host and chief monkey, and this is the Wall Street Oasis podcast. Join me as I talk to some of the community's most successful and inspirational members to gain valuable insight into different career paths and life in general. Let's get to it. In this episode, member D. Sika shares his path starting out as a financial advisor for Merrill Lynch back in 2006 to transitioning twice internally with a critical mentor connection. Learn how he pivoted to Visa, got promoted to director, and eventually helped co-found his own FinTech venture capital fund. He also shares one piece of advice he gives to younger folk graduating today to build meaningful connections. Enjoy. All right, David, thanks so much for joining the Wall Street Oasis podcast.
My pleasure.
So
Thanks for having me.
It'd be great if you could give the listeners a short bio.
Yeah, so my name is David Sika. I'm a partner at NICA Partners, which is a FinTech-focused firm here in New York City. We're currently investing out of our third fund. My background is I started my career at Merrill Lynch in 2006, actually into a financial advisor training program, and then broke into an investment banking analyst class where I worked on CMBS origination and securitization. Spent some time briefly in emerging market equity research sales covering Russia, Middle East, Africa, and then in 2008 met the guy that was taking Visa public, Hans Morris, and was joining as president. And I moved to go work for Visa in San Francisco. And at that point, really got interested in what was happening in the payment space. And payments was kind of the early first wave of what was going to be happening in FinTech. And in late 2013, teamed back up with Hans, and he was thinking about starting a FinTech-focused firm to really fill this white space in the market, which there were a lot of talent, a lot of capital entering FinTech across all of these different product lines, but there was really no firm that specialized in connecting entrepreneurs to the existing financial system. So that's what we set out to build with NICA.
You've been doing it for 6 years. Yeah, 6 years. So you were one of the founding partners.
Yeah, I was in the founding team.
Great. So let's go all the way back to undergrad. So you said you joined Merrill almost in their financial advisory group. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So when you were back in undergrad, were you always thinking finances for me? This is what I know what I want to do. I know you majored in finance, but when was the kind of decision made in that? Was it is your family in finance? Is there kind of a history there?
No, I mean, my dad owned a construction company. My mom was a school principal. I was always interested in business, I think, from a young age, like growing up in a home where, there was a family business attached to it. So I remember my sister telling me, she was like, she encouraged me to go into either finance or accounting. And so I really didn't have, I'd say a great knowledge of like what that path would look like or what the different options were, and sort of started figuring out while I was at school. And did you
have internships there while you were in school, or did you kind of just come into senior year and we're still looking for a full-time gig?
No, I worked all throughout school. I interned, well, actually during the summers, I would do a combination of, working at my father's construction company, interning at Merrill Lynch. And then during the year, I interned for Senator Corzine for probably 3 years. And then I also sold watches at a store in Washington, D.C.
So you were hustling the whole time to help pay for college?
No, it wasn't. I was. I mean, it was spending money at school, and I was just interested in different things, and I thought it was a great city to be in to kind of get that experience of learning a little bit about government, and then the watch thing. I guess I sort of fell into, but it was a
So,
lot of fun.
so were your junior summer, how did you end up in the financial advisory side of Merrill? How did that kind of whole process take place?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I realized early on at GW was a non-recruited school, and these, in my, kind of selection of a, my selection of a college, it was, I really didn't appreciate how important that was going to be if you wanted a career in finance.
And so tell me how you ended up at Merrill. Did you just get an internship junior year? Was it senior year that you kind of started doing the financial advisory side, or did you get recruited? Was it on campus? Did they come, or you said there was no on-campus presence?
No, I actually met someone I went to high school with, introduced me to their cousin who
Okay.
worked there, and I had interned in their group, and it was actually a very sophisticated group at Merrill. And then one of these two brothers that were on the team sort of split off and asked me to join them upon graduation. And truthfully, I didn't really want to go into being an FA, but I sort of felt that if I could get my foot in the door at Merrill in New York, it would at least put me in a place where I could potentially, transition to another group. So I kind of went in knowing that I didn't want to do that forever.
So you knew you didn't want to do it forever, but you saw it as kind of a foot in the door because you weren't able to. Had you tried to apply to investment banking internships? I assume that's what you ended up doing, right? Or you ended up on the CMBS desk?
Yeah, I mean, I actually leveraged contacts I'd made in Corzine's office to get a whole bunch of interviews at a super day that didn't pan out.
And any advice specifically looking back on those in terms of why you don't think they panned out, or do you feel like it was just too much of an uphill battle and really competitive?
I mean, again, this is a long time ago when this happened, but
of course.
my feeling was that I had asked, I'd called in a favor, and the recruiting, the on-campus recruiting programs in the super days are, really such a set channel for how, for how folks make their way into it. I don't think it was the best setup, in terms of just kind of showing up at the super day with, literally everybody in the room sort of wondering why you're there.
Like, who's this guy?
Yeah, how did he get this interview? Why is he here?
Got it. So you don't feel like you had built up the rapport or the contacts. It wasn't like at least through the rounds you hadn't put in the work. It was kind of more like they slotted you in as a favor, but you didn't really have a fair shot in the same way either.
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah,
so
I hadn't met people through the process or built any relationships.
Had you been doing some networking in terms of? So did you know what investment banking was? Because you said I knew I didn't want to do FA, financial advisory, long term. So you did you know that target was investment banking in undergrad as your first, or one of your first jumps out of undergrad? Or was it kind of less, was it more murky to you in terms of what?
I mean, it was more on I wanted to be on the institutional side of the business. Yeah, I really didn't have many options. I was trying to network the best I could. I was trying to find people who knew people to, get sort of coffee meetings. And I think through that work and through that journey, I started putting the pieces together of what each job entails. And
got it.
So
how long? So how long are you an FA at Merrill before you're kind of able to make that jump? And tell me a little bit about that transition. Was it tricky, or did it piss off your?
Yeah, it was incredibly tricky.
So tell me a little bit about that. How did you even have that conversation with your boss in FA? Oh, sorry, I'm gone after a year, or however long it was.
Well, I didn't. I ended up. I knew I had my roommate in college said he knew what I was trying to do, and he came to me and he said, "Listen, if there's any chance that you're going to pull this off, there's one person I've met," and he was working at Goldman at
Mhm.
the time. He goes, "There's one person I've met who's an MD here who would sort of appreciate your story, and you should meet him." And so I went. I met with, I met with this guy, and he wasn't convinced that, I think he was convinced I wanted to not be an FA, but I don't think he was convinced that I really wanted this job. So he put me through. Yeah, he gave me a bunch of stuff to read, a bunch of research reports, books,
Mhm.
and said, "Hey, go take a look, read through all of this stuff, work with your friend when you have questions, and then let's meet up in a month and come and revisit this." And I think that went on for about 4 meetings, where it was sort of like a real estate. He's like, kind of like real estate university. Like, you need to demonstrate to me that you really understand what this industry is. At least you've done the research from the outside to, like, to describe to me that this is what you want.
When you say this, are you specifically referring to like front office investment banking? Are you referring to like trading, sales and trading, or just all of it? Just being
Front office, yeah, front office investment banking.
so like on the sales and
And
trading side, or more like
it was
M&A
just
or
on, it was mostly, it was just on, at this point, it was just on the real estate side.
real
And
estate. Okay.
the groups were organized a little differently. Like at Merrill, we had all of real estate on one floor, where you'd have advisory, you'd have our private equity group, which was an LT and funds, CMBS, securitization, and then, that would like closely map to the trading function,
Hmm.
or the sales and trading function. And so I kept going through these meetings, and I kept doing the research, and I kept having conversations, and it lasted for a few months. And I'd say towards the end of it, I didn't have much hope that this was going to work out, but I
Why,
figured I would see it through.
why did you say that? Just because he kept kind of forcing you to go back and learn more?
He didn't seem convinced. He was still a little skeptical, and
Do you think that was because you said something early on about FA not quite being the spot for you, and so he thought that was why, or do you think it was something else, some other reason why you couldn't convince him?
I think it was probably the former. I think it was like, I think he could believe I didn't want to be an FA, but I don't think he fully believed that I wanted to, be in his industry.
Got it.
And yes, I kind of kept doing the work and kept going to meet with him. And then eventually he came, he sends me an email one day with, I think it had about 15 names on it. And he said, "Here's group heads and MDs. I've given them a call. I've given them sort of the background I've given them your background. I've told them about the work we've done, and they would be interested in meeting with you." So I called the first person on the list, who was at Merrill Lynch, and got right into an interview process.
Wow. So you somehow, so your friend that told you about this MD at Goldman, how did he know that this MD would kind of take you under his wing? Because you became basically a mentee, right? Like he was your mentor, right? For how many? 4 months, 5 months, or however many
Yeah,
days.
about that.
So why did your friend think that your story would resonate specifically with this MD? Was he an alum from George Washington? Was he just
No, I think he had a sort of he's from New Jersey, had a blue collar background,
Mhm.
sort of understood the challenges of like switching from a blue collar to a white collar mindset and world.
Fair?
And yeah, I just think he would appreciate that, was
Hmm.
was was really what he was getting at. He'd appreciate kind of what you're doing and some of the challenges, and could be if he takes a liking to you, he could be a big supporter of yours.
That's great. So was that a shock when you got that email with the 15 names? Or were you like
Yeah,
super excited?
I was like over the moon. I couldn't. because at that point, I mean, it's one of the things I've also realized in my career is that it's when I'm confident I'm sort of doing the right work and providing the right inputs, and I feel like I'm doing all the right things, but it's just not happening.
Mm-hmm.
It's usually at that point that something is about to change. And I don't think I realized it early on, but like through my experience and having it happen over and over again, it's sort of when you're in that this is never going to happen phase, why am I still doing it? It's probably when you have a chance of it happening.
So it's kind of like in the back end, right? When you're starting to have some despair and losing hope, that's about when it's going to change.
Yeah, it's like when you start losing some hope, you're kind of you're at
close.
the point where you're getting closer.
Interesting. So you're at Merrill for how long as a FA before this whole transition happens? A year?
I was probably there for a year and a half.
Year and a half. Okay, so you immediately get into an interview process.
And it's funny because the program I was in was called POA, and it was a formal sales training program, and it was really hard. Like we would have to, get up in front of a room of 50 people and run through a pitch, and they really taught people how to work with clients.
Was it a little boiler room-esque where you're like, sell me this pen kind of thing?
No, it wasn't.
Yeah.
It was way more sophisticated. It was tough. It was, describe these complicated products and,
right.
Sort of how do you work with a retail investor to try to help them understand how they could be writing covered calls on their portfolios or, doing pledging assets to get mortgages. And it was looking back on it, was pretty sophisticated stuff. And but it came in, that training has come in very, very handy throughout my career in terms of
being able to sell.
Being able to sell and sort of understanding the playbook and the framework for how you do it.
Fair. No, I can see
the
that.
Process.
I think oftentimes when people get stuck in those, whether it's a cold call FA role or it's a heavy sales role, it's often extremely difficult, but it's often they look back on it later in their career and say, wow, that was actually really useful.
I would say the same.
Yeah. So you're a year and a half in, you get this interview through this, I'll call it the golden email from your mentor. Do you feel like if you had emailed any of those 15 people, you would have been in an interview process? Probably, right? So is there a reason you just started from the top, or did you actually look through all the 15 people before you decided, hey, I'm going to choose this top one?
I'd looked through all of them. I kind of felt that I was already at Merrill. I liked Merrill quite a bit. So yeah, that's why. So at that point, I was just assuming there were going to be a whole bunch of no's. So I was like, I'll start at the top and work my way through.
Fair. Okay. So you got into an interview process right away. This is for the CMBS desk. And was it a tough interview? Was it super easy because you had that recommendation from a higher up? What was it like? Was it technical? Was it mental math? Do you remember anything about that interview?
It wasn't super easy. I wouldn't say it was as technical as like going into a super day or going into something, that was really that structured. And it was also at a time where there was, the group was doing a tremendous amount of volume, and I think they needed folks to help out.
So it was like the right time they were growing. I mean, it makes sense.
Timing was good as well.
Late 06, early 07, the cracks hadn't kind of started showing yet, right?
Yep.
So you get to the desk, and how long before do you feel like things started to shift in terms of you were there till June, right? So tell me, like, did you start kind of getting a bad feeling where you're, hey, I should start looking, or what was the whole process from going from Merrill to Visa? Can you talk to me a little bit about that? I mean, I know what
From
happened
Merrill to,
to Visa
well,
as a
there was another step in there
okay.
where things were going well. You know, I really loved the group, loved the work. Things were, you know, I couldn't have been happier. And then, you know, it was really abrupt where it was. We had a securitization market that sold, and then it was just sort of, we're done. Like we're not doing another. And Merrill, he was like, they gave us our bonus and then said, and this was kind of ironic, but
Mm-hmm.
I was lumped into the second year analysts.
Okay.
So they said like, you're, because what happened in 1998 is, my understanding, wasn't around, but you know, there was, Wall Street had laid off a bunch of people that were in recruiting, like from recruited schools, and then there was the backlash from the colleges to say,
Okay.
you know, you recruited these people, and then however many months later, you laid them off. So I got put into this like protected group at Merrill, where we were being redeployed. So it was, you don't have any work in your current group. You know, you're eligible to go and find other jobs within, you know, within the, within the company,
Mm-hmm.
and HR will be calling you. So it's
Got
kind of ironic, right? Because now I'm being protected by the analyst class that I like wasn't eligible to go, you know,
it.
to get into the proper way. And we never got calls from HR. So we started figuring out who other people were around the bank, and started figuring out who the HR people were, and, you know, reaching out and having conversations, and then realized that, you know, let's say there's like 70 people that fall into this criteria, that they're in affected areas, they're in the analyst program. People that were above would have been laid off in this moment,
Yep.
but there were, you know, like 2 front office jobs available.
Right.
In that mix. The rest were sort of middle office, back office functions.
So you basically, the writing was on the wall of like, hey, I'm not going to get one of those 2 out of the 70 people that are looking, that are protected. So you started looking elsewhere outside the firm, or tell me, what was your
No, I went and got one of the 2.
Oh, you did. Okay. So you,
Yeah. So I interviewed for this. It was an emerging market equity research sales desk.
okay.
So
Tell
it's
me
like
about
a
that.
totally different. It was super. It was super interesting. It was a, you know, very international group on the trading floor. We were working on, you know, basically doing roadshows for research analysts, and selling equities in, you know,
Were-
foreign IPOs to U.S. institutional investors.
So were you actually helping prepare the reports themselves, or were you more on the sales side where you're kind
It
of
was
trying
more on the sales side,
the sales side? Okay. And
and you know, that was also very, very interesting. It was, hours were crazy because we'd have a morning conference call with all the offices around the world, and we would often also be the last off the trading floor at night. But it was, you know, it was pretty. I thought it was fascinating. I thought you know, learning about new markets, you're learning about new
mhm.
business names, and then one day, and then through like kind of while this process of going for this job was going on, I started interviewing with Visa.
Got it. And
And
so you ended up getting one of the few front office jobs
mhm.
that was available, yet you had already kind of started some outside discussions. And what prompted you to jump? Like, what was the final thing of like, hey,
Well, I
it's
got laid off. I mean, I ended up getting laid off from the sales desk. What I had negotiated was the real estate group would lend my headcount
mhm.
to the trading group, and then actually the head of the desk didn't know I was being laid off until I called him and said, hey, I got called to HR. And it turns out what happened was further reduce the real estate group I'd come from.
Got it. So you were still technically under that head count.
Yeah.
And so
And
that got
then,
reduced.
and then I remember calling everybody I knew through everything we just talked about. And the general message was, I can't help at all. I'm pretty sure I'll be laid off at any time. And I had this great opportunity to go to Visa. And so I thought it would be a pretty interesting move at that point.
So tell me a little bit about, but you had an interesting opportunity. How did that opportunity present itself? I mean, this is the worst possible time to be looking for a job, right? It's the middle of the
yeah. It was so unique. It came in through Merrill's HR, and during the roadshow, Hans had asked, the book runners on the deal that you wanted to start a program where Visa would hire 7 people who were sort of around that point in their career to move out to California and create kind of the first wave of that junior to mid-level, lower mid-level talent, with a finance background.
In what specific division? Like, what were you doing specifically for them?
Well, the way it worked is each person was placed into a different business unit. So there was one person in finance, there was one person in marketing, product, etc.
Mm-hmm.
I ended up being the last into that program, and the only open seat was in sales. So it was sort of sales, and but in Visa's terms, that's kind of managing FI banks as well as managing, merchants and acquirers that accept Visa. So it was a really interesting way to learn the business, because that's where, those are the 2 main parties that connect into the Visa system.
Okay, and so you're there, brought into the sales desk as kind of this new program, and you eventually get promoted. You're there for from 2008 to 2013, right? So almost 5.5 years. And as you're going through there, are you getting promoted? It's kind of a new program. So what was the process like, and what was the visibility? What was your thought process as you're going through that?
Yeah, I mean, I started to realize, like, it was an interesting situation, because we were the first, we were sort of coming into this company where most of the people around had been there for 15 or 20 years. And I changed my perspective quite a bit, where at that point I had abandoned, ever going back to like a finance role,
mm-hmm.
and became pretty excited about what was going on. And what I liked about the payments industry in 2008 is that it was very small. You could walk into, the person's office who was responsible for sort of, helping build out the network, helping do these key deals throughout the last 10 or 20 years that kind of shaped the industry we'd known it at that point. And it was a big industry, right? It was, payments touched many things, and it was a great company. It had a great culture. So I really sort of shifted and went as deep as I could to build out and meet as many people as I could in the industry, to learn as much as I could. And I'd say the one thing I did differently was spend a lot of time with the people who had been at Visa for a long time, to understand the history and to understand, like, to put things in context as to why they were a certain way. And and then I was getting promoted, and there were a bunch of reorgs, and ultimately helped create this analytics team that was working on global acceptance strategy. So helping make decisions like, which country should we focus on when we enter the country, what segments within that country are top priority, and then once we choose a segment, what are the what are the key deals we could do, actual commercial agreements that we can put in place to convert cash and check to electronic payments on the Visa system.
And that was kind of near the end of you had kind of almost been promoted to the point where you were almost like an internal consultant, data analytics, creating that team, right? But what was the progression from when you got there in sales, like your day to day versus what it was at the end? Obviously, at the end, you're probably managing some people, right?
Well, that actually happened early on in terms of creating the team.
Okay.
And then it progressed to being out in front of actually executing the deals that we were.
Can you give me an example of like a deal that you were executing? Like how would I think about that as an outsider? Because I know very little about the payment space or like what goes on at these companies.
Yeah. So a common deal I was doing at the end was, what had happened was you had the Durbin Amendment, which put an interchange cap on debit transactions, and it was part of Dodd-Frank.
Okay.
And it also had a routing provision where there needed to be multiple options for merchants to route PIN transactions on. So when you turn over the back of your debit card and there's like Interlink, Maestro, Shazam, these types of names, you couldn't just have Visa and Interlink, which are the same company, or MasterCard and Maestro, which are the same company. So that sort of happened. There was this lawsuit settlement that had been going on in terms of interchange fees that was led by the merchants. And then while this was, so these were two monumental changes in the industry, sort of this new regulation as well as this settlement. And then while all this was happening, all these new ideas started popping up. Mobile wallets, using transaction data to present customers with coupons on their mobile phones. And a common deal that I would do would be to engage with a merchant and basically put an incentive agreement in place where they would commit, a portion of those transactions because they now had a choice as to where a transaction could be routed. So I worked on a lot of routing agreements with retailers, and then simultaneously, getting them to pilot and try new, some of the new ideas that were popping up.
Got it. Okay, fair enough. So
it was pretty sophisticated because it was pretty tough because you were dealing with essentially a client that was, had been part of a class action lawsuit. This new regulation, and helping them understand how this would be interpreted and what decisions they would have to make. And then ultimately the decision they should make is, working with us. And then on top of that, kind of layering in new pilots on new technology. At that time, they were very unfamiliar with it.
Got it. So tell me why leave? It sounds like you're getting promoted. You're doing challenging, but interesting work at Visa. Why kind of go out and start your own thing? It's just the opportunity was too good to pass up? Or tell me a little bit about your partner and kind of the discussions that kind of led to NYCA.
Yeah, I mean, I'd moved back to New York and I'd helped start this this networking group in New York. And we were basically hosting these discussion panels, and would have a little networking afterwards, and it was pretty small. And I started meeting people from all the other companies. So I started meeting people from Amex and MasterCard, and started meeting startups, and I guess it sort of clicked for me that there really weren't that many people in this industry that were doing what we were doing. And then you're sort of reading, and this is again my perspective, not sort of how I got there, not how Hans got interested in it, but I was looking at what was going on in the startup world, and I remember looking at Uber and Airbnb, and I'm like, that's exactly what we do, right? Where we understand sort of the all of the rules and the way a payment transaction flows, and how to optimize for lower costs and higher approvals. And I had, I remember going back and forth and just sort of had this sense that there was a bigger opportunity there, and that my group was pretty well positioned. The people that were doing what I was doing at Visa were pretty well positioned to work for these types of companies. And but it took a little while to get there. And so I just continued, sort of doing my role at Visa. I continued doing this networking event, and then eventually, I was meeting with, who's the head of the firm now, and I was describing, and he goes, "I think you should go work for one of those companies." So I went and I interviewed at Braintree and at Klarna.
Okay.
And so at the time, Braintree was doing the card processing for Airbnb and Uber, and I think Stripe had just been started. And then Klarna was sort of a point of sale financing based in Sweden.
Okay.
And then that's what I was going to do. So I was going to go into a senior BD, sales role at Braintree or Klarna, and I got very close to going to Klarna, and I was going to move to Sweden. I was going to help them.
What stopped you from doing it? From pulling the trigger?
I felt that the way e-commerce transactions worked in Sweden were just very different from the rest of the world, and the company had been incredibly successful, and I just got a sense through the process that it was going to be a very tough mission to expand this. My role was going to be expanding acceptance into the UK.
It was going to be tough to get to do that.
Yeah, and I just didn't. And I probably would have taken it if management recognized how hard it was going to be. If there was sort of this appreciation for, we know this is a tough task, but their attitude was more, no, we're pretty confident this is going to go pretty easily. So it was,
so you didn't.
So I got right to the finish line. I was right about to sign, and I decided not to. And then a few weeks later, I got a phone call from Hans, who said he was at General Atlantic and he's looking at a lot of earlier stage. He'd become interested in earlier stage companies and said, "I'm thinking about starting this new type of firm. Would you be interested in, if you're going to move to Sweden, if you're definitely going to, if you're up to doing something, a little crazy, would you be interested in coming with me to help figure this out?" And it was a 1.5-minute long conversation. I said yes.
Interesting. So was the idea that you'd come in and kind of be one of the founding partners? How did, however much you're willing to disclose in terms of like the initial fund? You said you're on your fourth fundraise now, or fourth fund?
Third.
Third. So you're in your third fund. And was the initial fund, was it mostly friends and family, or through, your own funds personally, where you had to kind of just scrap it together to get that first fund off the ground, or how?
Well, I think the idea was that the idea for NICA was that we felt there was white space in the startup market, and there was a need for a firm who could help. If you're building, enterprise software and you want to sell it to banks and insurance companies, there weren't many options at that time for you as an entrepreneur, or even for you as a lead investor. So the idea was, well, we think there's room for a new type of firm. The other idea we had was, let's curate our LP base. So that we have experts in our, that are investing their own capital, but can also help the portfolio. So can also kind of roll their sleeves up and help create value within that portfolio.
Was there any sort of
those were the two ideas, which was like, kind of some white space in the market and a new approach to raising a fund where, in order to have that expertise at the company, you don't need to keep expanding and hiring more people into the general partnership.
Got it. So tell me, how has that, I mean, you've been there for now, so you've been running this for 6 years. How has it evolved? I mean, obviously you're investing out of your third funds and things have gone well. Tell me a little bit about how, the types of firms you're looking for. And then before we wrap up, I'd love to talk a little bit about any advice you'd give to your younger self.
Yeah. Um, no, things are working. I think we've built a very unique firm in that, um, we really want to work within, within the existing industry. So we think there's a lot of value in, lead investors who are great at helping companies scale a venture-backed company and being a coach to the CEO and, helping recruit, early employees and tech founders. And in FinTech, that's not enough, right? You're going to need a partner who can help you sell into enterprise, who can help you structure a balance sheet if it's a lending business, who can help you, work with regulators in a, kind of proactive way. And yeah, it's been an incredible journey, and it's working really well. In our first fund, it was really, could we get access to those great deals we were seeing from the, from the sidelines, so to speak. And then, over time, it's, well, if we're adding value, can we increase our ownership in deals? And, our third fund's now 211 million.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going really well. I mean, in terms of what we look at are, we cover 4 themes, 30 sub themes. So pretty much everything within FinTech is inbounds.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's, obviously sub themes that are, kind of, sub themes that are, get hotter than others at certain times. And,
Of course. Yeah.
really looking for where are the most talented teams deciding to spend their time, and then, we kind of will evaluate and come in with our thesis and see if it fits at that point.
Perfect. And so before we call the pod, anything any advice you'd give to your younger self looking back now, coming out of school, and you made several small jumps while at Merrill and then kind of quickly got promoted at Visa. Any advice you'd give to your younger self knowing what you know now?
Yeah, I'd probably say, doing some more research and having a better idea at an earlier age of what these different industries look like, and what the work entails.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to say, like, when you're to your 18-year-old self, but I'd say the other thing too is, just sort of embracing your strengths,
Mm-hmm.
and, kind of finding something that fits your skill set and fits your personality. And
How can kids do that? How do kids know what their strengths are at 18 or 19? Is it just kind of, or how do they even how do they do this research? And besides the Wall Street Oasis and other Googling, is there other ways? Should they be meeting as many people as possible at that young age? All
Yeah,
right.
I think so. I mean, I think, the one advice, the one thing I tell everybody that
Mm-hmm.
ever asks me is, view relationships as, when somebody introduces you to someone, or if you meet someone, kind of view that as the first meeting for a 30-year relationship.
Mm.
And, take a perspective that you're going to have and maintain relationships long term. And I think the earlier you can do that, the better it'll suit you. It's pretty obvious when people are transactional.
Mm.
So there's no secret to it, but it's just, right. That's always the perspective I take in a relationship, is this is somebody I'm going to know for the rest of my career,
Right.
to treat them as such, and, handle follow-ups, and, find ways to explore whether or not you can work together. So I think that holds true for even at a younger age.
And so kids that
Because
are coming to a mentor and they're maybe a little intimidated when speaking to someone like you, how should they come across that way? Besides following up, should they follow? Is there certain cadence that you would suggest in terms of them following up with you so that they don't feel like they're bothering you too much, but at the same time, they're developing that relationship?
Yeah, I mean, I think coming in with a productive, like coming in with an agenda of items that they want feedback on or that they're helping, that they're thinking about. I always like to, even to this day, like in meetings, coming with one to do for myself, right? Because it's a way where you can demonstrate that, you have the ability to kind of sit in a meeting, drive it to an actionable step, and then complete it.
Got
And
it.
I think that's always served me well, right? Like even in a meeting where you're like, I'm not sure what the point of this was, coming out with something,
Yeah.
some sort of task that you can complete.
Great. Well, anything else you'd like to share before we call it?
No, that was great. And thanks so much for reaching out. And
Yeah, David, I
look
appreciate
forward to seeing you soon.
I appreciate you taking the time. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Cheers. And thanks to you, my listeners at Wall Street Oasis. If you have any suggestions whatsoever, please don't hesitate to send them my way, Patrick at wallstreetoasis.com. Until next time.